Picture this scene from September 1931. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force in human history, sits anchored in a Scottish harbor. But something's wrong. The sailors aren't working. They're singing songs on deck, refusing orders. The British Empire's ultimate symbol of strength has just mutinied over a pay cut. Within days, the pound sterling collapses, marking the end of Britain's unchallenged dominance of global finance. How did the empire that ruled a quarter of the world manage to economically destroy itself in just over a decade? And why did they keep doubling down on policies that were obviously failing? If you want to understand how modern governments can make catastrophically stupid decisions in the name of financial credibility, hit that subscribe button and stick around. Because we're about to dissect one of history's most expensive acts of national self-harm. The year is 1918. Britain has just won the Great War, but the victory celebration in Trafalgar Square masks a terrifying reality known only to a handful of Treasury officials. The empire is financially gutted. To fund 4 years of unprecedented warfare, Britain had liquidated a century of accumulated wealth. Foreign investments were sold off. Railways in Argentina and mines in Africa traded for American steel and Canadian wheat. When those assets ran dry, they borrowed massively. National debt exploded from about £600 million in 1914 to around £7 billion in 1918. Much of it owed to the United States in dollars. Britain emerged from the trenches as a fundamentally different economic creature. Before 1914, it was the world's creditor. By 1919, it was a debtor. While British factories had churned out artillery shells, American and Japanese competitors had stolen their export markets. The industrial heartland was bloated, inefficient, and technologically backward compared to new rivals. But here's where the story gets interesting, or rather, where it gets insane. The British elite refused to accept this new reality. Politicians in Westminster and bankers in the City of London convinced themselves that the economic carnage was just a temporary glitch. They believed that with the war over, the natural order would reassert itself with London back at the center of the financial universe. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it was a psychological addiction to past glory. For the British ruling class, normalcy meant one sacred thing above all else: the gold standard. Before the war, this system had been the anchor of global economics. Every major currency was pegged to a specific amount of gold. You could walk into the Bank of England with a £5 note and demand 5 gold sovereigns in return. Because the pound was literally as good as gold, it became the world's reserve currency. Global trade was conducted in sterling. This financial dominance was the secret sauce of British imperial power, allowing a small island to control global capital flows. When war erupted in 1914, Britain had suspended the gold standard out of necessity. They needed to print far more money than they had gold to back up. The predictable result was inflation. During the war, prices more than doubled. By the early 1920s, the pound was trading at around 340 instead of its pre-war rate of 486. To the proud men running Britain, this devaluation wasn't just embarrassing, it was seen as a moral failure, a betrayal of everyone who had trusted British financial integrity. So they made a decision that would haunt Britain for the next decade. They would return to gold at the exact same exchange rate that existed before the war. They wanted to turn back the clock and pretend the economic devastation had never happened. This wasn't economics. It was nostalgia with a price tag measured in human suffering. The problem was arithmetic. To force the pound back up to its pre-war value required brutal deflation. The government had to make money scarce and expensive, forcing prices and wages down across the entire economy until the pound was strong enough to stare down the dollar again. It was economic strangulation undertaken in the belief that financial credibility was worth any price. The Bank of England, led by the imperious Governor Montague Norman, began the squeeze. They raised interest rates, choking off credit to businesses. The Treasury slashed government spending, cutting housing and social programs. The goal was simple: make life hard enough that costs would fall, wages would fall, and the pound would naturally rise back to its former glory. It was economic anorexia, the country trying to starve itself back into shape. By the early 1920s, this policy was already drawing blood. While bankers in London applauded the strengthening currency, the industrial heartlands were hemorrhaging. In the coal mines of Wales, the shipyards of Glasgow, and the cotton mills of Lancashire, order books were drying up. As the pound got stronger, British goods became more expensive for foreign buyers. A ton of steel that cost a French buyer 100 francs in 1920 might cost 120 francs in 1922, purely because of currency shifts. British industry, already struggling with outdated machinery and fierce competition, was being priced out of global markets by its own government. Unemployment climbed past 1 million, then past 1.5 million. The homes fit for heroes promised to returning soldiers became slums of despair. But the financial elite regarded this suffering with an almost religious stoicism. They viewed unemployment not as a tragedy, but as necessary medicine. The bitter cure required to heal the patient. In 1924, this tragic farce reached its climax with a fateful political appointment. Winston Churchill became Chancellor of the Exchequer. Today we remember Churchill as the wartime leader who saved civilization, but in 1924 he was a politician searching for a legacy who knew almost nothing about economics. He famously admitted that when he looked at Treasury figures, the numbers swam before his eyes. Churchill was a romantic who loved grand gestures and imperial glory. When he arrived at the Treasury, the high priests of finance immediately surrounded him. Montague Norman and top civil servants whispered seductive messages about his destiny to restore Britain's honor by returning to gold. They told him it was the only way to banish inflation forever and make London the center of the world once again. But Churchill had doubts. Unlike the bankers, he was a man who had seen the trenches and instinctively worried about what this policy would do to working people. In private memos, he questioned why the interests of finance should override the interests of industry. He wrote, "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content." To resolve his doubts, Churchill hosted a famous dinner party. He invited the leading proponents of the gold standard, but also their most vocal critic, the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was the rock star of economics, already famous for predicting that the Treaty of Versailles would lead to disaster in Germany. Now he turned his analytical firepower on British Treasury policy. At the dinner, Keynes laid out a devastating argument. He told Churchill that the pre-war exchange rate was a fantasy given the new economic reality. Based on relative production costs, the pound was actually worth about 10% less, perhaps 440 instead of 486. If Churchill forced the pound back to 486, he would be artificially overvaluing the currency by 10%. This meant every British exporter would effectively be slapped with a 10% tax on their goods sold abroad, while every foreign importer would get a 10% subsidy. To make British goods competitive again at that high exchange rate, companies would have to cut costs by 10%. Since the biggest cost for coal mines and steel mills was labor, that meant cutting wages. Keynes looked Churchill in the eye and warned him, "If you do this, you are declaring war on the working class." You will force employers to slash wages, and that will lead to strikes, social chaos, and the destruction of British industry. Churchill listened and was troubled. But the weight of the establishment was crushing. The Bank of England governor, Treasury officials, city financiers, and Conservative Party leaders all told him that Keynes was an eccentric radical who didn't understand the moral necessity of sound money. They appealed to Churchill's vanity and patriotism, warning that if Britain didn't return to gold, the United States would permanently eclipse the empire. Churchill caved. He chose the advice of bankers over the warning of the economist. He chose the past over the future. On April 28, 1925, Winston Churchill stood up in the House of Commons to deliver his budget speech. With his trademark rhetoric, he announced that Great Britain was returning to the gold standard at the pre-war parity of 486. "We are often told that the gold standard will shackle us to the United States," Churchill declared. "I will tell you what it will shackle us to. It will shackle us to reality." The House erupted in cheers. Members waved their order papers. The City of London rejoiced. The Times declared it a masterpiece of statesmanship. It was seen as the moment when wartime chaos finally ended and order was restored. But outside the Westminster bubble, Churchill's reality hit immediately and brutally. Almost instantly, the price of British coal in international markets jumped. Foreign buyers who had been purchasing British coal for decades looked at the new prices and switched to cheaper German or Polish alternatives. British coal owners, already operating on razor-thin margins, saw the 10% price hike wipe out their entire profit. They were now losing money on every ton they extracted. The owners had only one option to survive: reduce costs. They couldn't cut machinery or transport expenses, so they had to cut labor costs. On June 30, 1925, just 2 months after Churchill's speech, coal owners announced they were terminating the existing national wage agreement. They told miners that wages would be cut by 13 to 25% and that working days would increase from 7 to 8 hours. The miners were outraged. They were already among Britain's poorest workers, doing dangerous, dirty, exhausting labor. Now they were told they had to work longer hours for starvation wages just so London bankers could enjoy a strong currency. The miners' union leader A.J. Cook coined a slogan that became the battle cry of the British working class. "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." Keynes's prediction had come true faster than even he had imagined. The return to gold had transferred the cost of the nation's debt directly onto the shoulders of its hardest-working citizens. The strong pound was essentially a tax on Durham coal miners to subsidize Kensington wine importers. Realizing that a massive strike was imminent and they weren't prepared, the government bought time by offering a temporary subsidy to keep wages up for 9 months. It was a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. During those 9 months, both sides prepared for war. The government set up emergency supply networks to keep the country running without coal. The unions organized the Triple Alliance of miners, transport workers, and railway workers, pledging solidarity. Churchill, watching the gathering storm, reportedly began regretting his decision. He realized he had been misled by financial experts who promised the gold standard would bring stability. Instead, it was bringing class warfare. But he couldn't back down now. The prestige of the empire was staked on the value of the pound. The deadline for the subsidy expired in May 1926. Mine owners refused to back down on wage cuts. Miners refused to accept them. The owners locked out the miners. On May 3, 1926, Union solidarity held. The call went out across Britain. Buses stopped running. Trains stopped moving. Docks fell silent. Newspaper printing presses halted. The general strike had begun. It was the largest industrial dispute in British history. Over 1.7 million workers walked off the job. The country was paralyzed. It felt like the beginning of a revolution. And at the heart of this chaos, invisible but unyielding, was the gold standard, the golden chain strangling the life out of the British economy. For 9 days, the machinery of state stopped. The silence in shipyards and factories was deafening. It was a battle of wills between organized workers desperate to protect their livelihoods and a government determined to enforce the economic logic of the gold standard. But the government had a weapon the unions hadn't anticipated: the middle class. Thousands of university students, stockbrokers, and retired army officers volunteered to drive buses, unload ships, and run trains. They saw themselves as defenders of the Constitution against anarchy. Churchill, the man who had inadvertently triggered the crisis, was now in charge of the government's propaganda newspaper, the British Gazette. He treated the strike not as an industrial dispute over wages, but as an insurrection. The rhetoric worked. The leadership of the Trade Union Congress, terrified that they were losing control and drifting into revolutionary territory, capitulated. On May 12th, after just 9 days, they called off the general strike without securing a single guarantee for the miners. It was a betrayal that mining communities would never forgive. The miners, abandoned and alone, refused to surrender. They stayed out for another 6 grueling months, watching their children grow thin, selling furniture for food, burning floorboards for heat. But you cannot strike against arithmetic. By November 1926, starvation forced them back into the pits. They accepted longer hours and lower wages, crushed by the golden straitjacket. The government and City of London breathed sighs of relief, believing they had won. Order was restored. The pound was safe at 4.86. They expected that with the strike over and wages cut, the British economy would finally boom. But the boom never came. From 1926 to 1929, while the rest of the world enjoyed prosperity, Britain sat in the economic corner. In the United States, this was the era of the Roaring Twenties. American industry exploded with cars, radios, and skyscrapers built at dizzying pace. Even France and Belgium, who had sensibly devalued their currencies after the war, saw their industries recover and exports grow. Britain remained stuck in the mud. The fundamental problem hadn't disappeared. The pound was still overvalued, British goods still too expensive. The wage cuts weren't enough to compensate for the 10% handicap imposed by the exchange rate. To keep the pound pegged at 486, the Bank of England had to maintain high interest rates. If they lowered rates to help businesses borrow and expand, gold would flow out of London to New York, where returns were better. So Montague Norman kept his foot on the brake at the exact moment when British industry needed cheap money to modernize and retool. Old industries continued their slow, painful death spiral. Unemployment never dropped below 1 million. In some northern industrial towns, 70% of men were out of work, standing on street corners in flat caps. The surplus people of an empire that had sacrificed them for a currency symbol. The British elite consoled themselves with the mythology of sound money, believing this suffering was buying credibility and playing the long game. But in 1929, the game board was flipped over. The Wall Street crash shattered the global economy, triggering the Great Depression. The initial shock hit Britain hard as American loans to Europe dried up and global trade collapsed. Already fragile British export industries were decimated. Unemployment surged from 1 million to 2.5 million by 1930. The real crisis that would finally break the gold standard was a banking crisis that spread across Europe like a plague in the summer of 1931. It started in Austria with the collapse of Credit Anstalt Bank, spread to Germany causing bank runs there. To prevent the German economy from imploding, massive amounts of capital were frozen. London banks had lent heavily to Germany, and suddenly those assets were trapped. The City of London, banker to the world, was caught in a liquidity trap. They owed money to France and America, but couldn't retrieve their money from Germany. Foreign investors examining the books realized the Bank of England didn't have enough gold to cover its liabilities. The run moved from Berlin to London. In July 1931, the run on the pound began. Every day, millions of pounds in gold were withdrawn from Bank of England vaults and shipped to Paris and New York. Governor Montague Norman was so overwhelmed by stress that he had a nervous breakdown and fled to Canada, leaving deputies to fight the fire. The Labour government, led by Ramsay MacDonald, was trapped. To save the pound and stay on gold, economic orthodoxy demanded they balance the budget and restore confidence. But tax revenue had collapsed due to depression, creating deficits. Bankers in New York and Paris sent a clear ultimatum. We will lend you money to defend the pound, but only if you cut government spending, specifically unemployment benefits. It was a cruel choice. To save the currency, the government had to cut the meager lifeline keeping millions from starvation. The cabinet was paralyzed. Half the labor ministers refused to cut benefits, arguing it betrayed the working class. The government collapsed. In August 1931, a national coalition was formed with conservatives, liberals, and a few labor defectors, still led by MacDonald. Their sole mandate was saving the gold standard. They did exactly what bankers demanded, passing emergency budgets that raised taxes and slashed unemployment benefits by 10%. They also cut wages for all public sector employees, teachers, police officers, sailors. They inflicted misery on the entire nation to defend the mystical figure of 486. Believing that if the pound fell, civilization itself would collapse. They terrified the public with stories of hyperinflation like Weimar Germany. But they pushed too hard. The wage cuts sparked a reaction no one in Whitehall anticipated. On September 15, 1931, the Atlantic Fleet of the Royal Navy was anchored at Invergordon in Scotland. When sailors heard their pay was being cut, pay barely sufficient to support families, they mutinied. It was a polite British mutiny with no violence. Sailors simply refused to work, gathering on decks to sing songs. But news that the Royal Navy, ultimate symbol of British power, was mutinying sent shockwaves through global financial markets. If the government couldn't control its own navy, how could it control its currency? The run on the pound became a stampede. In 3 days, the Bank of England lost nearly all remaining gold and foreign currency reserves. They spent millions of borrowed dollars trying to buy pounds and prop up prices. But it was like catching a falling knife. On Saturday, September 19, 1931, Bank of England directors met in emergency session. They looked at empty vaults, read telegrams from New York refusing further loans, and realized the game was over. They had starved miners, crushed industry, slashed benefits, and provoked naval mutiny. They had endured a decade of stagnation, all to defend the gold standard. And they had failed. On Sunday, September 20th, the government issued a statement. Britain was suspending the gold standard. The pound would no longer be redeemable for gold, but allowed to float and find its own market value. The elite braced for apocalypse, expecting the pound to become worthless, riots to erupt, and London to lose its status as a financial center. But Monday morning brought something strange. The pound fell, yes, dropping from 486 toward roughly 340, ironically the exact kind of level it had reached in the early 1920s before this tragic experiment began. But the sky didn't fall. There was no hyperinflation. Milk was still delivered. Buses still ran. In fact, almost immediately, the economy began breathing again. With a cheaper pound, British goods suddenly became competitive on world markets. A Rolls-Royce or cotton bale was now roughly 30% cheaper for Americans or Frenchmen to buy. Exports ticked up. Because the Bank of England no longer had to defend the gold peg, they could slash interest rates. Cheap money flooded the economy, sparking a housing boom in London suburbs and southeastern England. New industries like aviation, automobiles, and electronics began growing, funded by cheap credit. The years following departure from gold weren't disastrous, but marked the beginning of recovery. Britain actually recovered from the Great Depression faster than the United States, largely because they abandoned the golden straitjacket 2 years before Roosevelt did. The tragedy of the 1920s was complete. The British people realized with sick, sinking feelings that the suffering of the last decade had been for nothing. The unemployment, strikes, and hunger were unnecessary, self-inflicted wounds caused by men in London who cared more about past prestige than present reality. But the damage went deeper than economics. The immediate aftermath of devaluation created what became known as the Two Britons. In the South and Midlands, where new industries were based, cheap money triggered booms. Middle classes bought semi-detached houses with indoor plumbing and electricity. They bought cars and went to cinemas. For them, crisis was over. But in the north, in Welsh coalfields, Scottish shipyards, and northeastern steel towns, depression never ended. These were industries sacrificed on the altar of the strong pound in the 1920s, starved of investment for 10 years. Their machinery was obsolete, workers exhausted, markets gone. Even with a cheaper pound, these industries couldn't compete. The damage from the golden straitjacket was terminal. This economic apartheid created desolate landscapes of ghost towns. In places like Jarrow, a shipbuilding town in the northeast, unemployment hit around 70%. These were men who had built battleships that won World War I, now officially classified as surplus to requirements. The government, still terrified of inflation and debt, refused to help, adhering to orthodox beliefs that markets would eventually fix themselves. But markets didn't fix themselves. They left these people to rot. In October 1936, desperation boiled over into one of the most iconic moments in British history: the Jarrow Crusade. 200 men from Jarrow, dressed in their Sunday best raincoats, began marching 300 miles from northeast England to London. They weren't marching to riot or overthrow the government. They were marching simply to ask for the right to work, carrying a petition asking for a steelworks so they could feed their families. They marched through rain and wind, sleeping in church halls and barns. Ghosts of the gold standard walking through the countryside. When they finally arrived in London expecting to be heard, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin refused to see them personally. Worried about setting bad precedents, he ensured the petition was formally received, but gave them nothing concrete. They were given a token contribution for the train fare home and sent away. The Jarrow Crusade failed to get jobs, but succeeded in searing the image of the left behind into national consciousness, proving that the economic wounds of the 1920s had created a class of effectively non-citizens, abandoned by financial calculations of the city. This bitterness fueled political extremism. Just as economic chaos in Germany led to Hitler, misery in British industrial heartlands became recruiting grounds for radicals. Sir Oswald Mosley, a charismatic aristocrat and former Labour minister, looked at parliamentary paralysis and decided democracy was failing. He founded the British Union of Fascists, wearing black shirts, holding rallies, telling unemployed men the only way to save Britain was crushing bankers and politicians who sold them out. While society fractured, the empire itself changed shape. Having lost financial power to enforce global free trade, Britain retreated behind walls. In 1932, at the Ottawa Conference, Britain abandoned the free trade principles that had guided it for a century, establishing imperial preference with tariffs against American and German goods, while trading freely with colonies like Canada, Australia, and India. It was a defensive crouch. The empire, once a global commerce engine, became a closed block huddling for economic warmth, an admission that Britain could no longer compete in open markets. The gold standard disaster had forced the empire to shrink its horizons. Intellectually, the disaster vindicated John Maynard Keynes. For a decade, he had been the voice in the wilderness warning that the gold standard was a barbarous relic. Every prediction he made came true. The suffering of British workers proved his central thesis that economies don't automatically fix themselves. When stuck in depression, governments must step in, spend, borrow, and prioritize employment over currency values. His book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, published in 1936, was essentially an autopsy of British policy failures from the 1920s. It revolutionized economics and killed the gold standard idea forever. The post-war world order we live in today was built on Keynesian ideas, designed specifically to prevent the rigid stupidity that crushed British coal miners. But lessons often come too late. By the late 1930s, storm clouds gathered over Europe again. When Britain faced Nazi Germany in 1939, it did so as a weakened power. Its industrial base was smaller and less efficient than Germany's. Its shipyards struggled. Its treasury wasn't the bottomless gold pit it had been in 1914. To fight Hitler, Britain had to borrow again, but this time not on their own terms. They borrowed from the United States, and Americans, remembering interwar financial chaos, drove hard bargains. They demanded cash and carry payments, then lend-lease agreements. In exchange for destroyers and oil, Britain had to hand over gold reserves, sell remaining American investments, and lease naval bases to the U.S. Navy. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the wealth transfer was complete. The British Empire wasn't just bankrupt, but financially liquidated. The gold that Montague Norman and Winston Churchill had tried desperately to protect in the 1920s was gone, shipped to Fort Knox to pay for guns to liberate Europe. The golden straitjacket story is a tragedy of good intentions. The men who made these decisions, Churchill, Norman, and Treasury officials, weren't evil. They were patriots who believed they were doing the right thing to restore national glory. But they committed the cardinal sin of economics. They fell in love with the symbol and confused the map with the territory. They believed national strength was found in coin values rather than people's productivity. They sacrificed the real economy to save the financial economy and lost both. In the end, the British pound is just a promise. In the 1920s, the British government broke its promise to its own people to keep a promise to a yellow metal. It's a stark reminder to every modern government that economies exist to serve society, not satisfy ledgers. When that balance is forgotten, empires fall. The pattern repeats throughout history whenever leaders prioritize financial abstractions over human reality. The tools change, but the fundamental choice remains the same: serve the people or serve the symbol. Today, we see echoes of this mistake in countries that sacrifice domestic prosperity for exchange rate credibility, in central banks that prioritize inflation targets over employment, in governments that impose austerity to please bond markets while their citizens suffer. The specific mechanisms evolve, but the underlying delusion persists: the belief that economic symbols matter more than economic reality. The British experience of the 1920s stands as history's clearest warning about what happens when financial ideology overrides human needs. It's a lesson written in the unemployment lines of Glasgow, the hunger marches from Jarrow, and the broken dreams of millions who paid the price for their leaders' monetary mysticism. Next time you hear politicians talk about the sacred importance of currency strength or fiscal credibility, remember the coal miners of Durham who worked longer for less so bankers in London could feel proud about exchange rates. Remember that behind every abstract economic principle are real people whose lives hang in the balance. The map is never the territory, and the symbol should never matter more than the substance it's supposed to represent. That's why understanding these historical disasters matters. Not just as interesting stories, but as survival guides for navigating a world where the same human impulses, the same institutional blindness, and the same dangerous confusion between financial symbols and economic reality continue to shape our lives. If you want more breakdowns like this on how money, power, and bad decisions actually work, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of this very real economic horror series.